The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was scrubbing someone else's toilet for $9 an hour, my third cleaning job of the day, and my knees already aching against the cracked linoleum of a studio apartment that smelled like cat urine and regret. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I almost ignored it, but then I remembered Ryan had a doctor's appointment that morning, and my heart seized with the familiar grip of fear that had become my constant companion since his diagnosis 6 months ago. I peeled off my rubber gloves and answered with hands still damp, leaving wet marks on the screen. It was Sandra from Elite Domestic Services, the agency that sent me to the houses of people who could afford to pay someone else to clean up their messes, and her voice had that carefully neutral tone that meant she was about to offer me something unusual. She asked if I was available for a special client, a private request that came with specific requirements and an unusual rate. And when she said $500 for 1 hour of work, my breath caught in my throat because that was more than I made in an entire week of scrubbing and dusting and pretending I didn't notice the way some clients looked through me like I was part of the furniture. I asked what the job was, and Sandra paused before saying it was a reading position. Someone wanted me to come to their estate at 9 p.m. and read bedtime stories for exactly 1 hour. And the silence on my end must have stretched too long, because she added that the client was very particular about privacy, and I would need to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Every instinct I had screamed that this was wrong, that legitimate jobs didn't come with NDAs and secrecy, and rates that were 5 times the normal amount. But then I thought about Ryan in his hospital bed with those purple shadows under his eyes, and the way he tried to smile when I visited, even though I knew the chemotherapy made him feel like his bones were rotting from the inside out. I thought about the letter from the hospital billing department sitting on my kitchen counter, the one that outlined the experimental treatment that might save his life and cost more than I would make in 5 years, the one that insurance had already denied twice. I heard myself say yes before my brain caught up with my mouth, and Sandra's relief was audible as she gave me the address and told me a car would pick me up at 8:30 that evening. She mentioned the NDA again and said the client valued discretion above all else, that I should dress professionally but comfortably and bring whatever books I thought appropriate for bedtime reading. After I hung up, I sat on the bathroom floor of that cat urine apartment and stared at my phone, at the address Sandra had texted me, at the name of the client that meant nothing to me then but would soon mean everything: Dante Russo. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of anxiety and speculation, my mind racing through possibilities both mundane and terrifying, and by the time I got home to my own small apartment, I had convinced myself a dozen times to cancel and then talked myself back into going because $500 was $500, and Ryan needed me to be brave even when I didn't feel it. I showered and changed into the only professional outfit I owned, black slacks and a cream blouse that I usually saved for the rare job interview, and I packed a small bag with some of my favorite books from childhood, the ones my mother used to read to me before she died and left me to raise Ryan alone at 23. The Velveteen Rabbit was on top, its cover worn soft from years of handling, and I ran my fingers over it like a talisman before tucking it into my bag. The car that arrived at 8:30 was not what I expected. A sleek black sedan with tinted windows, and a driver who didn't speak except to confirm my name before opening the back door with mechanical efficiency. I climbed in, and the leather seat smelled expensive, that particular scent of wealth that I only ever encountered in other people's homes. And as we pulled away from my building, I watched my neighborhood disappear behind us. We drove for 40 minutes, leaving the city behind, and heading into the wealthy suburbs where houses sat behind gates and walls, where trees lined private driveways and the streetlights were decorative rather than functional. The fog had rolled in with evening, turning everything soft and slightly unreal, and when we finally turned onto a long driveway flanked by iron gates that opened automatically, I felt like I was entering another world entirely. The mansion that emerged from the fog was something out of a Gothic novel, all stone and sharp angles and windows that glowed with warm light against the darkness. The driver pulled up to the front entrance where a woman waited, older and stern-faced, wearing a simple black dress that somehow conveyed more authority than any uniform. She opened my door before the driver could and introduced herself as Margaret, the head housekeeper, her voice crisp and professional, and completely devoid of warmth. She led me inside without small talk, through an entrance hall with marble floors and a chandelier that probably cost more than my entire life, and I tried not to stare at the artwork on the walls or the fresh flowers in vases that were taller than me. We walked through several rooms, each more opulent than the last, and I noticed things that made my pulse quicken with unease. Security cameras in every corner, their small red lights blinking like watchful eyes. Shadows of men moving outside the windows, too purposeful to be gardeners at this hour. The faint smell of cigar smoke and something metallic that I couldn't quite identify. Margaret stopped at a door in what appeared to be a private wing of the house, far from the main living areas, and she turned to face me with an expression that was measuring and cold. She pulled out a thick document from a folder she'd been carrying and explained it was a non-disclosure agreement, that I would be legally bound not to discuss anything I saw or heard in this house. That violation would result in serious consequences, both legal and otherwise. The way she said otherwise made my hands shake as I signed my name at the bottom, wondering what kind of consequences she meant and whether I should run right now while I still could. But then I thought about Ryan and the $500, and I told myself that rich people were just paranoid about their privacy, that this was probably nothing more than an eccentric billionaire who didn't want the press knowing about his weird habits. Margaret took the signed NDA and opened the door, gesturing for me to enter, and what I saw inside made every warning bell in my head start ringing at once. The room was beautiful in a way that felt wrong, like someone had tried to create a sanctuary but couldn't quite hide the darkness underneath. Dark wood furniture and soft lighting and a massive four-poster bed with expensive linens, but also shelves lined with pristine children's books that looked like they'd never been opened, their spines uncracked and perfect. A reading chair positioned beside the bed, angled just so, with a small table next to it holding a glass of water and a lamp. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, and the walls were painted a deep blue that made the space feel like being underwater. But what struck me most was the smell: expensive bourbon and leather and men's cologne, the scent of masculinity and wealth and something faintly medicinal that reminded me of hospital rooms and sickness. This was not a child's room. This was a grown man's bedroom dressed up with children's books like a costume that didn't quite fit. Margaret stood in the doorway and told me the rules in that same crisp voice, that I would read for exactly 1 hour, starting at 9 p.m., that I should not ask questions or make assumptions, that I should not look directly at him unless he spoke to me first, that I should accept whatever I saw with discretion and professionalism. I heard myself ask him, the word coming out before I could stop it, and Margaret's expression didn't change as she confirmed that yes, I would be reading to a man, not a child, that Mr. Russo was particular about his privacy, and the agency had been instructed to find someone suitable. I thought about the job posting Sandra had described, how she'd carefully avoided pronouns, and let me assume I'd be reading to a sick child, and I realized this had been deliberate misdirection. I asked if this was some kind of joke or something worse, my voice sharper than I intended, and Margaret simply repeated her earlier question about whether I could accept these terms, or if she should call me a car home. I stood there in that strange bedroom with its children's books and masculine scent, and thought about Ryan's hospital bills, about the experimental treatment that was his only chance, about how I'd already signed the NDA and walked through a mansion full of security cameras and men with guns at their hips. I thought about my mother and how she'd taught me that sometimes survival meant doing things that scared you, that dignity was important, but not more important than keeping the people you loved alive. I told Margaret I could accept the terms, my voice steadier than I felt, and she nodded once before checking her watch and informing me I had 5 minutes until 9 p.m. She left me alone in the room, and I heard the door click shut behind her, not locked, but definitely closed, and I was suddenly very aware of how isolated this wing of the house felt, how far I was from the entrance and the car and any possibility of escape. I sat down in the reading chair and pulled out The Velveteen Rabbit, my hands still trembling slightly as I opened to the first page and tried to steady my breathing. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat, could hear the distant sound of voices somewhere in the house, could hear the old building settling around me with creaks and sighs. I looked at the bed and tried not to imagine who would be lying in it soon. What kind of man paid $500 for someone to read him bedtime stories? What kind of life led to this moment? The clock on the nightstand ticked toward 9 p.m., and I gripped my mother's book like a lifeline, like a connection to something real and good in a situation that felt increasingly surreal and dangerous. I told myself I just had to get through 1 hour, 60 minutes of reading, and then I could leave with enough money to make a real dent in Ryan's medical bills. And if it turned out to be something I couldn't handle, I could always run. But even as I thought it, I knew I wouldn't run. Knew that I'd already made my choice the moment I said yes to Sandra on the phone, the moment I prioritized Ryan's survival over my own comfort and safety. The clock struck 9, and I heard footsteps in the hall outside, slow and measured, and I opened The Velveteen Rabbit to the first page and started reading aloud into the silence, my voice wavering only slightly as I waited to see who would walk through that door and what exactly I had gotten myself into. At exactly 9 p.m., I sat in the reading chair with The Velveteen Rabbit open in my lap, and the silence of the room pressing against my ears like water, heavy and expectant, and alive with possibility. I had changed my mind at the last second and pulled out Where the Wild Things Are instead, thinking that maybe whoever this was would prefer something with more adventure and less sentimentality, though I had no idea what preferences a man who paid for bedtime stories might have. My voice came out shaky when I started reading, the familiar words feeling strange in my mouth as I spoke them into the empty room. And I kept my eyes on the page because looking at the bed or the shadows or anywhere else felt too vulnerable. Let the wild rumpus start, I read, and my voice cracked slightly on the word rumpus, and I cleared my throat and tried again, forcing myself to project confidence I absolutely did not feel. The room stayed silent except for my voice and the ticking of the clock on the mantel and something else, something I almost missed at first, a sound so subtle I thought I might be imagining it. Breathing, measured and controlled, coming from somewhere beyond the partially open door to what I assumed was a bathroom or closet, and the realization that someone was already in the room with me, had been there the whole time listening in the darkness, made my skin prickle with awareness. I kept reading because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing, because Margaret's rules echoed in my head, and because I needed this money more than I needed answers to the questions multiplying in my mind. 15 minutes passed with excruciating slowness, each page turned loud in the quiet, and I was describing the wild things with their terrible roars and terrible teeth, when I heard footsteps, bare feet on hardwood, and a figure emerged from the shadows of the adjoining room, like something conjured from the story itself. He was not what I expected, though I'm not sure what I had been expecting. Maybe someone older, or obviously ill or visibly dangerous in the way movie villains are dangerous with scars and sneers and theatrical menace. Instead, he was beautiful in a way that made my breath catch. A man in his early 30s with dark hair that fell across his forehead in disheveled waves. Sharp features that looked like they'd been carved from marble by someone who understood both cruelty and grace. And eyes that were the most startling shade of green I'd ever seen, bright against the shadows under them that spoke of exhaustion so bone-deep it had become part of his face. He wore an expensive silk shirt in deep charcoal, untucked over dark dress pants, and his feet were bare against the floor, an incongruous detail that made him seem both more human and more unsettling. He moved with the kind of fluid grace that predators have, controlled and economical, every motion purposeful, even though exhaustion radiated from him like heat. He didn't speak or apologize or explain his presence, just crossed to the bed and settled onto it with the casual authority of someone who had never questioned his right to any space he occupied. And he closed those piercing green eyes and made a small gesture with his hand, that clearly meant, continue. My voice had stopped when he appeared, the words dying in my throat, and for a moment, I just stared at him sprawled across that massive bed like a king on a throne, dangerous and magnetic and utterly unexpected. Then I remembered the NDA and the $500 and Ryan's hospital bills, and I forced my voice to work again, picking up where I'd left off even though my hands were shaking enough that the book trembled in my grip. He didn't open his eyes or acknowledge me beyond that initial gesture, but I could feel his attention on me like a physical thing, could sense him listening with an intensity that made every word feel weighted and significant. I watched him as I read, unable to help myself, and I noticed things that made my pulse quicken with a confusion of fear and something else I didn't want to name. His hands gripped the comforter with white-knuckled intensity at first, tendons standing out along his forearms, and I could see scars there, thin, white lines that looked like knife wounds, deliberate and violent. There was a bruise along his jaw, recent and purpling, the kind of mark that came from someone's fist connecting with bone. His breathing was too controlled, like he was consciously managing it, forcing himself to relax through sheer willpower when every line of his body suggested he wanted to spring up and pace and move. I found myself adjusting my tone without meaning to, softening my voice and slowing my pace when I saw his fingers relax slightly against the fabric. And I realized I was reading to him the way my mother used to read to me when I had nightmares, gentle and steady and safe. The room felt smaller with him in it, the lamplight creating an intimate cocoon that made the rest of the mansion and the world beyond disappear, and I became aware of small sounds I hadn't noticed before. Distant voices of what must be guards or staff somewhere in the house, a phone ringing far away and then stopping, the old building creaking and settling around us, and underneath it all, the sound of rain beginning to patter against the floor-to-ceiling windows that I knew were hidden behind those heavy curtains. The bed dominated the space now that he occupied it, and he sprawled across it with unconscious possession, one arm flung above his head, and the other resting on his stomach, his chest rising and falling with that too-controlled breathing. He looked like he was trying to force himself to relax, like peace was something he had to consciously choose, rather than something that came naturally, and I wondered what kind of life made sleep into a battlefield. I kept reading and watching him, the story of Max and his wild things feeling oddly appropriate for this man, who seemed barely civilized despite his expensive clothes and refined features, and I saw the moment his jaw unclenched, the subtle shift in his shoulders that suggested some of that coiled tension was releasing. For just a moment, he looked peaceful rather than predatory, vulnerable in a way that made my chest tighten with unexpected emotion, and I realized this was why he paid $500 for someone to read to him. Not for the story itself, but for this. For 60 minutes where someone's voice could drown out whatever thoughts circled in his head like sharks. 20 minutes into the reading, he spoke for the first time, his voice low and rough like he didn't use it often or had been screaming recently, his eyes still closed and his body still seemingly relaxed on the bed. "Your voice is different from the others," he said, and there was something in his tone that might have been approval or might have been simple observation, stripped of inflection, less rehearsed. The words hung in the air, and I carefully marked my place in the book with one finger before responding, keeping my own voice neutral and quiet. "The others," I said, making it a question without quite asking one because Margaret's rules about not asking questions echoed in my head. "You're the 7th reader in 3 months," he said. And now he did open his eyes, those startling green irises fixed on me with an intensity that made me want to look away, but I didn't. Held his gaze because looking away felt like showing weakness, and I had the sense that weakness around this man would be dangerous. "The others performed," he continued, and there was distaste in his voice now, clear and sharp. "You're just reading." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I went with honesty, the same honesty that had probably lost me a dozen jobs over the years, because I'd never learned how to perform the way other people did, how to smooth my rough edges into something palatable. I'm a terrible actor, I told him, and I heard the way my voice carried a hint of self-deprecation, years of being told I was too blunt, or too direct, or too much somehow. What you hear is what you get. Something shifted in his expression, a minute relaxation around his eyes that might have been relief or satisfaction, and he studied me for a long moment before speaking again. "Good," he said, and the single word carried weight, carried meaning beyond its simple syllable. "I can't stand liars." Then he closed his eyes again and settled back into the pillows and made that same small gesture for me to continue, and I did, picking up the story and reading about Max returning home to find his supper waiting for him, still hot. I watched Dante Russo because now I knew his name and could attach it to this complicated man on the bed before me, and I saw the way he responded to my voice, the gradual softening of his features, the slowing of his breathing into something that looked more natural. His hands had released their death grip on the comforter and now rested loose against the fabric, and that coiled tension in his body had eased into something that almost looked like relaxation, though there was still a readiness about him, like even in rest he was prepared to move, to fight, to defend. The scars on his forearms caught the lamplight, and I wondered what kind of fights he'd been in, what kind of life left those particular marks, and the bruise on his jaw looked fresh enough that whatever had happened couldn't have been more than a day or two ago. The clock on the mantel ticked toward the end of the hour, and I transitioned to another book, pulling out the Velveteen Rabbit after all because I wasn't ready to stop and wasn't sure if I should, if stopping before the full hour would break some unspoken rule. The rain had picked up outside, a steady percussion against windows I couldn't see, and the sound created a rhythm underneath my voice that felt soothing, like we were in a shelter while the storm raged beyond. I read about the rabbit and the skin horse, and what it meant to become real, and I saw something flicker across Dante's face when I read the line about how once you are real, you can't be ugly except to people who don't understand, a tightening around his mouth that suggested the words had landed somewhere tender. When the hour ended, marked by the clock chiming 10, I stopped reading mid-sentence and looked at him, waiting to see what came next, if he would speak or dismiss me, or simply ignore me until I left. He opened his eyes and looked at me for a long moment, and in that look, I saw intelligence and calculation and something else, something that might have been gratitude or loneliness or both. "Same time tomorrow," he said. And it wasn't a question, wasn't a request, just a statement of fact delivered in that rough, low voice. "Margaret will have your payment." Then he closed his eyes again and turned onto his side, dismissing me as completely as if I'd ceased to exist, and I gathered my books with shaking hands and let myself out of the room. Margaret was waiting in the hall with an envelope that she pressed into my hands, and I didn't open it until I was in the car heading home. Didn't let myself believe the money was real until I counted out 5 crisp $100 bills in the privacy of the back seat. I looked out the window at the fog and rain and thought about the man in that room, about the way he'd looked almost peaceful for those few minutes, about his scars and his exhaustion, and the way he'd said he couldn't stand liars. I thought about being the 7th reader in 3 months, about how the others had performed and I had just read, and I wondered what it meant that he wanted me to come back. The city lights appeared through the fog as we got closer to my neighborhood, and I clutched the money in my hands and thought about Ryan and his medical bills, and told myself this was just a job, just a strange, eccentric, wealthy man who needed something I could provide, nothing more complicated than that. But I knew I was lying to myself, knew that something had shifted in that room between the reading and the silence, and the way Dante Russo had looked at me like I was offering him something more valuable than entertainment, like maybe for 1 hour I'd given him peace. When I got home, I sat on my couch in the dark and listened to the rain and wondered what kind of demons chased a man like that, what kind of nightmares made sleep into something that required another person's voice to achieve, and I knew that tomorrow at 9 p.m. I would be back in that chair reading to him again, not just because of the money, but because something in me recognized something in him, a kind of exhaustion and desperation that matched my own, even if the circumstances were completely different. 6 nights passed in a rhythm that became almost comfortable, almost normal despite the strangeness of it all, and I found myself looking forward to 9 p.m. in a way that had nothing to do with the money Margaret handed me in an envelope at the end of each session. The first night I had been terrified, the second night merely anxious, but by the third night I had begun to relax into the routine, to anticipate the way Dante would be waiting when I arrived, sometimes already on the bed with his eyes closed, sometimes sitting in the leather chair by the fireplace, watching the flames with that distant expression that suggested he was seeing something other than the present moment. He never spoke much beyond brief comments about my voice or the books I chose, never asked personal questions or offered information about himself, but there was a growing ease between us that felt significant even in its silence. On the fourth night, he stood by the windows the entire time, one hand pressed against the glass, while rain streaked down the other side, and I read to his back, to the rigid line of his shoulders, and watched as slowly that tension drained away until he leaned his forehead against the window, like a man finally allowing himself to rest. The fifth night, he asked me to read The Velveteen Rabbit again, the first time he had requested a specific book, and I saw the way his breathing changed during certain passages, the way his hands would flex and release as if he was fighting some internal battle. By the sixth night, I had learned which tone of voice soothed him fastest, had figured out that he responded best when I read slowly and steadily without dramatic inflection, when I let the words speak for themselves rather than performing them. I had also learned other things, small details that accumulated into a larger picture I was beginning to understand even if I didn't have all the pieces yet. The scars on his arms were definitely from knives, I had decided, too precise and deliberate to be accidents. The bruises that appeared and faded spoke of regular violence, of a life lived in conflict. The way Margaret and the other staff moved around him with deference and fear told me he was dangerous, powerful, someone who commanded absolute authority. And the security, the guns I glimpsed on guards, the cameras and gates and careful protocols, all suggested this was not just wealth, but something darker, something criminal. I didn't let myself think too hard about what that meant, because thinking about it would mean making decisions about whether to continue, and I needed the money too desperately to be principled about where it came from. On the seventh night, everything changed. The car pulled up to the mansion at 8:45 as usual, but something was wrong immediately. I could feel it in the air like electricity before a storm, and when I stepped out, I saw bullet holes in the marble columns flanking the entrance, fresh and stark, chips of stone littering the ground. My hands started shaking as I walked toward the door, but I didn't run, didn't turn back, because some part of me needed to know that Dante was all right, even though I had no right to care about his well-being beyond our transactional arrangement. The entrance hall was chaos, phones ringing unanswered, men in dark suits shouting into radios, the acrid smell of gunpowder still hanging in the air, and I saw blood on the floor, a smeared trail leading toward the back of the house. Margaret appeared from nowhere and grabbed my arm with surprising strength, her face tight with stress, and she pulled me through the mansion faster than I had ever moved through it, bypassing the usual route to Dante's private wing and taking back hallways I hadn't known existed. She didn't explain, and I didn't ask, just followed her with my heart hammering and my bag of books clutched against my chest like a shield. When she opened the door to Dante's room and pushed me inside, I saw him immediately, and understood why Margaret had brought me despite the obvious danger, despite every reason to send me home. He was pacing the room like a caged animal, all that careful control completely shattered, his movements sharp and aggressive and barely contained. His shirt was splattered with blood, dark stains across the expensive fabric, and there was a gun on the dresser gleaming dully in the lamplight, close enough that he could grab it in seconds. His hair was wild, his face was flushed, and his eyes, when they landed on me, were bright with something that looked like madness or fury or both, pupils dilated and unfocused. He looked at me, and I saw him flinch, saw the way his hands clenched into fists, and when he spoke, his voice was raw and angry and desperate all at once. "You should go," he said, the words coming out harsh and clipped. "It's not safe here tonight." I stood frozen in the doorway with Margaret behind me, her hand still on my arm, and I heard myself ask why Margaret had brought me up if it wasn't safe, my voice steadier than I felt. "Because I asked for you," he said. And now there was something broken in his tone, something vulnerable underneath the anger. "Because I'm selfish and I needed." And then he stopped himself, his jaw clenching hard enough that I could see the muscle jump, and he turned away from me to stare at the wall like he couldn't bear to look at me anymore. Margaret released my arm and left without a word, the door clicking shut behind her, and I was alone with this man who looked like violence incarnate, who had blood on his clothes and a gun within reach and madness in his eyes. I should have been terrified, and part of me was. But a larger part recognized something in his desperation, in the way he was holding himself together through sheer force of will, and I found myself moving further into the room, and setting my bag down and pulling out a book without consciously deciding to do so. "What book tonight?" I asked gently, the way I might speak to a spooked horse or a frightened child, and I saw him react to my voice, saw the way his shoulders dropped slightly, and his breathing changed. I chose The Giving Tree without waiting for his answer, something about the story of unconditional giving and sacrifice feeling appropriate for this moment. And I sat in the reading chair and opened to the first page, and started reading in my most soothing tone, the one I'd learned worked best on him. For the first few minutes, nothing changed. He kept pacing, and I kept reading, and I wondered if tonight would be the night my voice wasn't enough, if whatever had happened had broken through even this refuge. But slowly, incrementally, I watched the transformation begin. His pacing slowed, became less frantic, more measured. His hands unclenched and hung loose at his sides. His breathing evened out into something closer to normal. By the time I reached the middle of the book, he had stopped moving entirely and stood in the center of the room with his eyes closed, swaying slightly like he was drunk or exhausted, or both. Then he moved to the reading chair, to me, and I thought he would sit on the bed as usual, but instead he lowered himself to the floor beside my chair, his back against it and his head resting against the armrest near my leg, and the unexpected intimacy of it made my breath catch. I kept reading without pausing, without acknowledging the shift, but I was intensely aware of him there, close enough to touch. Close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body and smell the copper tang of blood on his clothes mixed with his cologne. I read about the tree giving everything to the boy, about sacrifice and love and the inevitable sadness of unconditional devotion, and I felt Dante's breathing slow further, felt the tension continue to drain from his body until he was slumped against the chair like a puppet with cut strings. My hand moved without my permission, reached out and touched his hair, fingers sliding through the dark strands that were softer than I'd expected, and I froze when I realized what I'd done, how I'd crossed a line we'd never discussed, but that had definitely existed. He didn't pull away. He didn't move at all except to lean slightly into the touch, and I felt something shift in the room, some fundamental change in what we were to each other. I kept reading with one hand on the book and one hand in his hair, and I finished The Giving Tree and started another book and then another, reading past the hour because stopping felt wrong, because he needed this and I could give it, and nothing else in that moment seemed to matter. When I finally stopped, when my voice was getting hoarse and the clock showed it was past 11, the silence that fell was so complete I could hear his heartbeat, slow and steady now, could hear his breathing, deep and even, could hear the old house settling around us. Then he spoke, and his voice was different than I'd ever heard it, stripped of all pretense and performance, raw and honest and devastating. Do you know what it's like to close your eyes and only see blood? He asked, not looking at me, staring straight ahead at nothing. My father's blood on my hands while he told me the names of the men who betrayed him. His last words weren't, "I love you." They were a hit list. The words hung in the air between us, and I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to that kind of confession. So I just kept my hand in his hair and waited. "Is that why you can't sleep?" I asked finally, gentle and careful. And he made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "I sleep," he said. 2 hours. Then I'm back there, in that warehouse, watching him die. 5 years of this. 5 years of closing my eyes and seeing him bleed out while I tried to hold his organs inside his body and listen to him name his killers. The stories, he continued, and now he did turn to look up at me, his green eyes clear and honest and full of pain. "When you read, I'm somewhere else. I'm not a killer for 1 hour. I'm just someone listening to a story." I looked down at this man, this dangerous, beautiful, broken man who ran a criminal empire and paid me to read him children's books. And I saw past the blood on his shirt and the gun on the dresser and the violence that clung to him like a second skin. I saw someone who had watched his father die and inherited a kingdom he never wanted, who couldn't sleep because of trauma and guilt, who needed the simple comfort of a voice reading stories because it was the only thing that quieted the demons in his head. My hand tightened in his hair, and I felt tears prick my eyes, though I didn't let them fall. "How long has it been since you slept more than 2 hours?" I asked, and he closed his eyes again. 5 years, he said simply. "Not since that night. The doctors gave me pills, but they don't work. They just make everything fuzzy without actually letting me rest. I tried alcohol, tried exhausting myself, tried everything. Then one night, I couldn't stand it anymore, and I grabbed a book from my sister's old room and tried to read myself to sleep the way my mother used to read to us, but I couldn't concentrate, couldn't focus on the words. So I hired someone to read to me instead." "The seventh reader?" I said quietly, remembering what he'd told me that first night, and he nodded. "The others were professional, polished, they performed like they were auditioning for a play. You just read, like it's normal, like I'm normal." "You're not normal," I said, and I felt him tense under my hand until I continued. "You're exhausted and traumatized and carrying weight no one should have to carry alone, but that doesn't make you a monster." He opened his eyes and looked at me again, and I saw something in his expression that made my heart ache, a desperate hope that he was trying to suppress. "Tonight," he said, and his voice was rough again. "Tonight we had a situation. Someone tried to move against us, thought we were weak, thought they could take what's ours. I had to handle it, had to make an example. The blood on my shirt," and he gestured vaguely at the stains. "It's not mine. I should feel something about that, should feel guilty or sick or anything, but all I feel is tired. So tired. I wanted to ask more, wanted to understand exactly what he'd done and why, but his eyes were already closing again, and his body was going heavy against the chair, and I realized he was finally, truly relaxing, was letting himself be vulnerable in a way he probably hadn't allowed in years. So I didn't ask questions, just started reading again, pulling out another book and beginning a new story while my hand stayed in his hair and his breathing deepened into something that looked almost like real sleep. The room was peaceful despite the chaos that had preceded it, the lamplight warm and soft, and I read until my voice was barely a whisper and I was sure he was completely unconscious. When I finally stopped and looked down at him, I saw what Margaret must have seen, what had made her bring me here despite the danger. With his eyes closed and his face relaxed and the tension gone from his body, Dante looked young, almost boyish. The sharp edges of his features softened into something gentle. He looked like someone who needed protecting rather than someone who did the protecting, and I felt something fierce and tender bloom in my chest. Something that had nothing to do with money or obligation, and everything to do with this complicated man who had trusted me with his truth. 2 weeks passed in a rhythm of reading and revelation, each night drawing us closer in ways that had nothing to do with the money that changed hands and everything to do with the intimacy of voice and vulnerability, and I had started to think of the hour in Dante's room as the most real part of my day. The only time when I wasn't performing or surviving but simply existing. I had saved every dollar he paid me, watched the stack of bills grow in the lockbox under my bed, and calculated obsessively how many more nights I would need before I could afford the experimental treatment Ryan's oncologist had mentioned, the one that insurance had already denied twice because it was still in trials and not proven effective enough to justify the cost. 14 nights at $500 each meant $7,000 saved, a significant amount by any measure, but still laughably insufficient when measured against the $350,000 price tag on my brother's potential survival. The call came at 6 in the evening on a Tuesday, Dr. Martinez's voice gentle and devastating in equal measure as she explained that Ryan's latest scans showed progression, that the standard chemotherapy wasn't working, that we were out of time for half measures and conventional approaches. She said the experimental treatment was his only real chance now, that without it, we were looking at palliative care and making him comfortable for however long he had left. And she was sorry. But we needed to decide within 2 weeks, because the trial had limited spaces, and if we couldn't commit, they would need to offer his spot to someone else. I stood in my tiny kitchen holding the phone and feeling the floor drop out from under me, feeling everything I'd been working toward suddenly compress into an impossible deadline, and I heard myself asking about payment plans or reduced costs or anything that might make this possible. Dr. Martinez's pause told me everything before she spoke, her voice heavy with the weight of having this conversation too many times. The trial requires full payment up front, she said. I'm sorry, Clara, I truly am, but those are the terms. I have the financial counselor's number if you want to discuss options. I took the number and hung up and stood staring at nothing while my world rearranged itself around this new reality, this ticking clock that had just appeared over my brother's head. 15 years old and running out of time, my baby brother who I'd raised after our mother died, who still believed the world was fundamentally good, because I'd tried so hard to shield him from the parts that weren't, who wanted to study engineering and build bridges and had never done anything to deserve this. I went to visit him at the hospital before heading to Dante's, needed to see him even though seeing him would break me, and I sat by his bed and held his hand while he slept, his skin pale and papery, his body so thin under the blankets that he looked like he was already disappearing. The smell of the hospital clung to my clothes afterward, antiseptic and illness, a smell I'd come to hate with everything in me. When the car picked me up at 8:30, I was barely holding myself together, my eyes dry through sheer force of will, but my hands shaking as I clutched my bag of books. The rain had returned, hammering against the windows as we drove through the fog toward the mansion, and the weather felt appropriate for the storm inside me, pathetic fallacy made real. Margaret met me at the door as usual, but her expression was different tonight, worried in a way I'd never seen, her eyes searching my face like she was looking for something specific. She didn't say anything, though, just led me through the familiar halls to Dante's room, and when she opened the door, I saw him already waiting by the fireplace, the flames casting shadows that made him look both gentle and dangerous in the flickering light. I sat in the reading chair and pulled out Charlotte's Web without really thinking about it, the book appearing in my hands like muscle memory, and I opened to where we'd left off the previous night and started reading. My voice was steady at first, carefully controlled, but somewhere around the part where Charlotte is weaving her web, where she's giving everything to save Wilbur, where the theme of sacrifice and love and inevitable loss becomes impossible to ignore, I felt the first tear slide down my cheek, then another. Then I couldn't stop them, couldn't control the way my voice broke and wavered, and I looked down at the page and saw my tears dropping onto it, darkening the paper. The first time I'd broken composure in Dante's presence, I tried to keep reading, but the words blurred and my throat closed, and I just sat there crying silently, shoulders shaking, while the book trembled in my hands. Dante went very still in his chair by the fire. I could feel his attention snap to me with laser focus, and then he was moving, crossing the room in 3 long strides, and suddenly he was kneeling in front of my chair, his hands reaching out to take the book and close it gently. The power position was completely reversed, this dangerous man on his knees before me, and his voice when he spoke was gentle but commanding in a way that made it clear he would not be denied. "Tell me," he said, "now." I shook my head, trying to pull myself together, trying to remember that this was a job and he was my employer and I had no right to burden him with my problems. "I'm sorry," I managed to say, my voice thick with tears. "I'll be fine in a minute. We can continue." "Clara," he said, and the way he said my name made me look at him, really look at him, and I saw genuine concern in those green eyes, saw something fierce and protective that made my heart ache. "Tell me what's wrong." So I did. I told him about Ryan, about the leukemia diagnosis 6 months ago, about how our mother died when I was 23 and left me to raise a 12-year-old alone, about how Ryan was everything good and hopeful in my life and I couldn't lose him. I told him about the experimental treatment and the impossible cost and the 2-week deadline and the $300,000 I didn't have and would never have, even if I worked every day for the rest of my life. I told him that Ryan was only 15 and wanted to go to college and study engineering and build things that would last beyond his lifetime. I told him my baby brother couldn't die because I couldn't afford to save him, and saying it out loud made it more real and more devastating, and I couldn't stop crying. Dante listened without interrupting, his jaw getting progressively tighter, his eyes burning with intensity, and when I finished he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "He won't die," he said, and his voice carried absolute certainty, the tone of someone who had never been denied anything he'd set his mind to. "I'll wire the money tonight. 350,000. Consider it done." I stared at him, shock cutting through the grief, and I felt hope flare bright and painful in my chest, even as my pride recoiled from the enormity of what he was offering. "I can't accept that," I said, shaking my head even as everything in me, screamed to say yes, to take what he was offering and save Ryan and deal with the consequences later. We don't have that kind of relationship. I work for you." "Is that what you think this is?" he said, and now there was intensity burning in his expression, something raw and honest. "You think I pay 7 women before you $500 a night. You think this is just a job." "Then what is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, and I saw him struggle with the answer, saw him weigh his words carefully before speaking. "You're the only person in 5 years who's seen me as something other than a monster or a mark," he said finally. "You read to me like I'm worth saving. Let me return the favor." "But this is too much," I protested, even as my resistance was crumbling under the weight of desperation and his steady gaze. "I can't possibly repay this." "I'm not asking you to repay it," he said. "I'm asking you to let me help. To let me do something good with this money that comes from doing terrible things." His hands moved to my face, cupping my jaw with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone I'd seen covered in blood, and his thumbs wiped away my tears with careful deliberation. "My sister was 6 when she died," he said quietly. "Cancer. Neuroblastoma. My father knew a rival family, the Morellis, who had connections to specialists at a research hospital, cutting-edge treatments that weren't available through normal channels. They offered to help. My father was too proud to accept. He said we didn't need charity from our enemies, that the Russos took care of their own, that accepting help would make us look weak. She died 3 months later. I was 17 and I watched her fade away, and I couldn't do anything to stop it because my father's pride mattered more than her life. I felt my breath catch, felt new tears spring to my eyes at the image of a 17-year-old Dante watching his little sister die needlessly. "I won't let another child die for pride," he said, and his voice was fierce now, determined. "I won't let your brother become another name on the list of people who could have been saved if someone had just swallowed their pride and accepted help. Clara, please, let me do this." I looked at him kneeling before me, this complicated, dangerous man who paid me to read bedtime stories because it was the only thing that quieted his demons, who had revealed his own childhood trauma to convince me to accept his help, who was looking at me like my answer mattered more than anything else in the world. The children's books on the shelves behind him took on new meaning now, monuments to a dead sister, a collection built by someone trying to hold on to innocence that had been stolen too early. I nodded, unable to speak, and I saw relief flood his face. He pulled me forward into an embrace, my face pressed against his shoulder, his arms solid and strong around me, and I let myself cry into his expensive shirt while he held me and murmured reassurances in a mix of English and Italian. "Thank you," I whispered when I could finally speak again. "Thank you. I don't know how to. I can't." "You don't have to," he said simply. "Just keep reading to me. That's payment enough." We stayed like that for a long moment, wrapped together in the lamplight with rain hammering the windows and the fire crackling in the hearth. And I felt something shift between us, some fundamental acknowledgement that whatever this was, it had moved far beyond employer and employee into territory neither of us had named yet. Then a knock on the door broke the moment and Margaret entered without waiting for permission, her face tight with concern. "Mr. Russo," she said, and her tone made Dante release me and stand in one fluid motion, his body language shifting instantly from gentle to alert. "We have a problem. Victor Kozlov has been making inquiries about Miss Bennett." Dante went very still, the kind of stillness that preceded violence, and I saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. "What kind of inquiries?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. "He knows she comes here every night," Margaret said, glancing at me with something like apology in her eyes. "He knows the timing, the routine. He's been asking questions about who she is, what she means to you." "One of our drivers was approached last week, offered money for information." I felt ice slide down my spine as the implications became clear, as the safe bubble of this room suddenly felt permeable and vulnerable. Dante's jaw was tight enough that I could see the muscle jumping, his eyes hard and calculating. "How much does he know?" he asked. "Not much yet," Margaret said. "The driver refused to talk and reported it immediately. But if Victor is looking, he'll find out eventually. And if he thinks she matters to you, she becomes leverage, a target." I watched Dante process this information, watched him run calculations behind those green eyes, and when he looked at me, I saw fear there. Real fear. Maybe the first time I'd seen that particular emotion from him. "We need to increase security," he said to Margaret, still looking at me. "Different cars, different routes, armed escort. And we need to," he stopped, something painful crossing his face. "We need to consider whether continuing these sessions is putting her at unnecessary risk." "No," I said, the word coming out sharper than I intended, and both of them looked at me. "I'm not stopping, not because of some rival gangster. Not after." And I gestured vaguely at what had just passed between us. At his offer to save Ryan. At the acknowledgement of what we meant to each other. Dante crossed to me in 2 strides, his hands on my shoulders, his expression intense. "You don't understand what Victor is capable of," he said. "What he would do if he thought hurting you would hurt me." "I understand that some things are worth the risk," I said, meeting his eyes steadily despite the fear curling in my stomach. "That running away doesn't actually keep anyone safe, it just means living in fear, that I won't let him take this away from us, from you." Something in his expression cracked, vulnerability showing through, and he pulled me against him again, his chin resting on top of my head. "You're either very brave or very foolish," he murmured. "Maybe both," I said, and I felt rather than heard his quiet laugh. Margaret cleared her throat, practical as always. "I'll arrange the additional security," she said. "But Miss Bennett, you should know what you're walking into. Viktor Kozlov is not a man who makes idle threats. If Dante cares for you, and she looked between us significantly, he does, then you've become a piece on the board. A way to hurt him." I nodded, trying to look more confident than I felt. "I understand." "Do you?" Margaret asked, not unkindly. "Because once you're visible in this world, there's no going back to invisible. Everything changes." I looked up at Dante, at this man who had just offered to give me $350,000 to save my brother, who held me like I was something precious and breakable, who had trusted me with his trauma and his vulnerability and his truth. I looked at the room around us, this sanctuary we'd created together, this space where he could be something other than a killer, and I could be something other than desperate. Then I looked back at Margaret and spoke with more certainty than I'd felt about anything in years. "Some things are worth fighting for," I said. "Some people are worth the risk." The money arrived in Ryan's treatment account within hours, Dante moving with the kind of efficiency that came from absolute power and unlimited resources. And by the next morning, Dr. Martinez was calling to confirm that Ryan had been enrolled in the experimental trial and would begin treatment within 48 hours. I sat in my apartment holding the phone and crying with relief so profound it felt like my bones were melting, like I'd been holding up the weight of the world and someone had finally taken it from my shoulders. Ryan called me afterward, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks, filled with hope and excitement about this chance, about maybe getting to have a future after all, and he asked how I'd managed to get the money so fast. I lied and said I'd found a benefactor, someone who believed in helping kids like him, and I heard the gratitude in his voice when he said I was the best sister anyone could ask for. I didn't tell him the truth, didn't tell him about Dante, or the nightly readings, or the complicated, dangerous man who had saved his life without hesitation. Some truths were too heavy to share with a 15-year-old who just wanted to live long enough to build bridges. When the car picked me up that evening, I was overwhelmed with gratitude and confusion in equal measure, my emotions a tangled mess of relief and debt and something else I wasn't ready to name. I clutched my bag of books and watched the fog roll past the windows and tried to figure out what accepting Dante's help meant for us, whether it changed the fundamental nature of our arrangement or simply revealed what had been true all along. The mansion appeared through the mist as always, solid and imposing, and Margaret met me at the door with her usual professional demeanor, though I thought I saw something softer in her eyes when she looked at me. She led me through the familiar halls to Dante's room, and I found him waiting by the window, his profile sharp against the glass, and when he turned to look at me, I saw relief in his expression that mirrored my own. Before either of us could speak, I crossed the room and hugged him, my arms going around his waist and my face pressed against his chest, and I felt his surprise in the way he went still before his arms came up to hold me back. "Thank you," I whispered against his shirt. "Thank you for giving me my brother back." "You don't need to thank me," he said, his voice rough and low, his hand moving to stroke my hair in a gesture that had become familiar over the past weeks. "I told you, this is what I wanted to do." We stood like that for a long moment, before I pulled back and tried to compose myself, tried to shift back into the professional distance that had defined us at the start, even though we both knew that distance no longer existed. I sat in the reading chair and pulled out The Secret Garden, thinking the themes of renewal and hidden beauty felt appropriate for this night, for this moment of new beginnings. Dante settled onto the bed as usual, his eyes already closing, and I began to read about Mary Lennox finding the key to the locked garden, about discovering something precious that had been hidden away. My voice was steady and calm, falling into the rhythm we'd established, and I watched Dante's breathing slow and even as the story worked its familiar magic. I was maybe 20 minutes into the reading, describing the garden beginning to come back to life, when I heard something that didn't belong in our sanctuary. a sound like firecrackers, distant but sharp, and Dante's eyes snapped open instantly, his body going from relaxed to coiled in a fraction of a second. "That was gunfire," he said, his voice completely changed, cold and lethal. And he was moving before I could process what was happening, crossing the room in 2 strides and grabbing my arm with bruising force. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying, the gentle listener becoming something predatory and dangerous, pure survival instinct overriding everything else. "Don't scream," he said, his voice hard and commanding as he pulled me toward the bookshelf on the far wall. "Don't fight me, trust me." More gunfire erupted, closer now, and I heard shouting and the sound of breaking glass, and my heart was suddenly hammering so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. Dante's hands moved over the bookshelf with practiced ease, pressing something hidden, and a section of it swung inward to reveal a dark space beyond. He pushed me inside without gentleness, his priority clearly my safety rather than my comfort, and he followed immediately, the bookshelf clicking shut behind us with a sound of finality that made panic claw at my throat. The space was tiny, maybe 6 feet by 4 feet, completely dark except for a thin line of light where the bookshelf didn't quite meet the floor. Reinforced walls, soundproofed, a safe room built into the mansion's structure, and we were pressed together in the darkness with barely room to breathe. Dante's body covered mine, his hand coming up to press gently over my mouth, and I could feel his heart hammering against my back, could feel the tension coiled in every muscle. Outside our small tomb, the sounds of violence continued, muffled but audible, gunfire and shouting, and the crash of something heavy breaking. I tried to control my breathing, tried not to panic in the confined darkness, and Dante's free hand moved to stroke my hair in a gesture that was both comforting and protective. His cologne mixed with my lavender soap in the small space, familiar scents in an unfamiliar nightmare, and I gripped his arm with both hands and tried to anchor myself to something solid. Minutes passed like hours, each second stretching into eternity while we waited in the dark and listened to the warfare beyond our hiding place. Dante's hand over my mouth was gentle despite the violence outside, his touch controlled and careful even now, and I realized that even in crisis, he was thinking about me, about not hurting me more than necessary. His breath was warm against my ear, and after what felt like forever, he started whispering, his voice so low I had to strain to hear it over my own heartbeat. "This is because Victor wants what's mine," he said, and I felt the words vibrate through his chest into my back. "The territory, the power, and yes, now you. Because I was stupid enough to let him see that you matter." I turned my head slightly, dislodging his hand enough to whisper back, "Is this because of me?" His arms tightened around me, and he was quiet for a long moment before answering. "This was always coming," he said finally. "Victor has been pushing for months, testing boundaries, looking for weakness. But you, yes, you gave him a target, a way to hurt me that he didn't have before." "Do I?" I asked, my voice barely audible in the darkness. "Matter." Another long pause, longer than the first, and I felt him struggling with the answer, with whether to give me truth or protection. "You're the only thing that's mattered in 5 years," he said finally, and the words were raw and honest and devastating. "The only thing that makes me feel human instead of just a weapon my father forged." I felt something break open in my chest, felt the last of my defenses crumble, and I realized with startling clarity that I had fallen for this man, not despite his darkness but because of how he carried it, how he protected what he loved, how he had trusted me with his vulnerability when he trusted no one else. "Then I'm not leaving," I whispered fiercely. "Not because of Victor, not because of danger. Some things are worth fighting for." "You don't know what you're saying," he said, and there was anguish in his voice now. "This world, it destroys everything good. It took my sister, my father, everyone I've ever cared about. I can't watch it take you too." Then let me be the thing it can't destroy, I said, turning in his arms as much as the small space allowed, my face finding his in the darkness. Let me be strong enough to stay. I felt more than saw him looking at me, felt the weight of his gaze even without light, and then his hand was cupping my face, and his lips were on mine, desperate and fierce and tasting like fear and relief and need. I kissed him back with everything in me, my hands fisting in his shirt, and for those few seconds the violence outside disappeared. The danger disappeared. Everything disappeared except the feel of his mouth on mine and the way his body trembled against me with emotion finally unleashed. The kiss broke when we both needed air, and he pressed his forehead to mine, his breathing ragged. I should never have let you come here, he whispered. I was selfish. I needed you, and I didn't think about the cost. I needed this too, I said. Needed you. Don't you understand that? Before he could answer, we heard a voice outside, muffled by the walls but clear enough. All clear. The threat is contained. Dante's body relaxed fractionally, though the tension didn't fully leave him, and he pulled back enough to find the hidden latch in the darkness, his hands moving with the certainty of someone who had practiced this escape route many times. The bookshelf swung open, and emergency lighting bathed us in red glow, hellish and surreal. And the sight that greeted us made my stomach turn. The reading room that had been our sanctuary was destroyed, furniture overturned, books scattered across the floor, bullet holes in the walls. We stepped out carefully, and Dante kept his body between me and the door, still protecting even though the immediate danger had passed. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her face pale but composed. "2 men down," she reported, her voice professional despite the tremor underneath. Marcus and Tony. Kozlov's crew breached the east entrance, but security contained them before they reached this wing. They're in custody now. Dante's jaw was tight, his hands clenched, and I saw grief flash across his face before he locked it down. Marcus had kids, he said quietly. Make sure his family is taken care of. Triple the usual death benefit. Margaret nodded, and then gestured toward the hallway. There's something you need to see. We followed her through the mansion, Dante's hand finding mine and gripping it tightly, and I tried not to look at the blood on the marble floors, the bullet casings scattered like deadly confetti, the signs of violence that had shattered our illusion of safety. In the entrance hall, still wet and dripping, someone had spray-painted a message in red that looked too much like blood. Your weakness will destroy you. I felt Dante go rigid beside me, felt rage roll off him in waves, and when I looked at his face, I saw something cold and lethal that reminded me exactly what he was capable of. Victor, he said, the name coming out like a curse. He's declaring war. We stood staring at that message, at the desecration of his home, and I felt the full weight of what my presence in his life had caused, the danger I represented simply by mattering to him. Dante turned to look at me, and I saw devastation in his eyes, saw him making a decision I knew I wouldn't like. I can't protect you and need you at the same time, he said, and his voice was hollow, defeated. I have to let you go. No, I said immediately, but he was already shaking his head. You don't understand, he said. Victor will keep coming. He'll use you to get to me. He'll hurt you to break me. And I can't. His voice cracked slightly. I can't watch another person I love die because of who I am and what I do. You love me, I said, latching on to the word he'd used without thinking. And I saw him realize what he'd admitted. That doesn't matter, he said, trying to retreat, trying to rebuild walls I could see crumbling. It's exactly why you have to leave. Why I have to end this before he kills you to hurt me. I stepped closer to him, into his space, my hand coming up to touch his face the way he'd touched mine so many times. You're not letting me go that easily, I said. Not after everything. Not after you saved Ryan. Not after you trusted me with your truth. Not after that kiss. We'll figure this out together. You can't fight a war and protect me at the same time, he said. But there was less conviction in his voice now, hope and fear warring in his expression. Then teach me to protect myself, I said. Give me the tools to survive in your world, instead of trying to lock me away from it. Let me stand beside you instead of hiding behind you. He looked at me for a long moment, this beautiful, dangerous, broken man who had given me everything and now wanted to give me up to keep me safe. And I saw the moment he realized I wasn't going to make this easy on him. You're insane, he said, but there was the ghost of a smile on his lips. Probably, I agreed, but I'm also not leaving. So you're going to have to figure out how to keep me safe while keeping me close, because I'm done pretending this is just a job, or that you're just my employer, or that what we have isn't worth fighting for. He pulled me against him, his arms wrapping around me tightly, and I felt him shaking with emotion he rarely let himself feel. The red emergency lights cast everything in shades of violence, and his men moved around us, clearing debris and processing the attack. But in that moment, it was just us, two people who had found something precious in the darkness and refused to let it go without a fight. I don't know how to do this, he whispered against my hair. How to love someone and keep them alive in this world. Then we'll learn together, I said. Just don't shut me out. Don't make decisions for me. Let me choose you, even knowing the cost. He was quiet for a long time, his face buried in my hair, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with unshed tears. If anything happens to you because of me, he said, if Victor hurts you, I won't survive it. You understand that. Then we better make sure nothing happens, I said, and I pulled back to look at him, to let him see the determination in my eyes. Because I'm not done reading to you yet, and you're not done learning how to sleep through the night, and we're not done figuring out what this is between us. Promise me you'll be careful, he said. Promise me you'll listen to security, follow protocols, not take unnecessary risks. I promise, I said. If you promise not to push me away, not to decide my safety is more important than my choice. He nodded slowly, reluctantly, and I knew this battle wasn't over, knew he would struggle with letting me stay in his dangerous world. But for now, in the wreckage of our sanctuary with Kozlov's threat dripping down the walls, we had each other, and that felt like enough to build on. The arrangements were made within 24 hours. Dante moving with the same ruthless efficiency he'd shown when funding Ryan's treatment. Except this time, every decision felt like a knife cutting through whatever we'd built together. New identity, complete documentation, a condo in Seattle far from his world, and Victor's reach. Enough money deposited in accounts under my new name that I would never have to work again. And Ryan's treatment would continue seamlessly with all bills paid directly by an anonymous foundation that couldn't be traced back to the Russo family. It was perfect and thorough and comprehensive, the kind of escape plan only someone with unlimited resources and deep paranoia could construct, and it was destroying me piece by piece as Margaret explained the details in her crisp, professional voice. I would leave tomorrow, she said. A private car would take me home to pack, and then directly to a private airfield where a plane would be waiting, and Dante wouldn't see me again, because clean breaks were safer than prolonged goodbyes. He was handling the Victor situation, she continued, and her expression suggested handling meant something violent and final, and once the threat was neutralized, I could potentially return if I chose to, though her tone made it clear she thought that would be a mistake. I listened to all of this sitting in Dante's reading room while he was elsewhere in the mansion, doing whatever deadly things he did, and I felt fury building in my chest, hot and righteous and clarifying. He was making decisions for me again, deciding my safety mattered more than my choice, and I had promised him I wouldn't take unnecessary risks, but this felt like the most necessary risk of all, staying and fighting instead of running and hiding. The car came at noon to escort me home, and I went without argument because Margaret was watching me with suspicion, and I needed her to think I was complying. But once I was alone in my apartment, I didn't pack. Didn't start sorting through my life to prepare for relocation. Instead, I opened my laptop and started researching everything I could find about the Russo-Kozlov conflict. News articles about territorial disputes and drug trafficking, court records of arrests and dismissals, social media posts speculating about organized crime in the city, and I read it all with the focused intensity of someone looking for a pattern, for the thing that didn't quite fit. Victor had been too successful recently. Too many of his moves had caught Dante off guard. Too many times he'd known things he shouldn't have known, and that suggested inside information, someone feeding him details about Dante's operations and movements. I thought about Margaret's insistence on exact timing for my visits, how she'd been unusually focused on maintaining the schedule even when I'd offered to be flexible, how she always knew precisely when I would arrive and when I would leave. I thought about how Victor had known about me, about the woman who visited the mansion nightly, information that could only have come from someone inside the organization. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity, and I felt my stomach drop because Margaret had been with the Russo family for decades, had been loyal through everything, and if she was the mole, then something terrible must have forced her hand. I called her directly, bypassing the usual protocols, and when she answered, I could hear the wariness in her voice. "We need to talk," I said, "in person, now." There was a long pause, and then she asked where, and I named a coffee shop near my apartment, public and neutral, and she agreed to meet me in 30 minutes. I got there early and took a table in the back corner where I could watch the door, my heart hammering with anxiety and certainty in equal measure. Margaret arrived exactly on time, her composure perfect as always, but I could see tension in the set of her shoulders, in the way her eyes scanned the room before settling on me. She sat across from me and folded her hands on the table and waited for me to speak. "You've been giving Victor information," I said quietly. Not a question but a statement, and I watched her face carefully for the reaction. She went very still, the kind of stillness that confirmed everything. And then her composure cracked just slightly, exhaustion showing through. "How did you know?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "The timing," I said. "You were too insistent about the schedule, too focused on predictability. And Victor knew about me, knew details that could only have come from inside. So either you're the mole or you know who is. And given how long you've worked for the Russos, I'm betting it's you, which means something forced your hand, because I don't believe you'd betray them willingly." She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw her weighing her options, calculating whether to deny or confess, and then something in her seemed to break. "He has my granddaughter," she said, and her voice was thick with suppressed emotion. "Elena. She's 8 years old. Victor's men took her 3 months ago, said they'd kill her if I didn't cooperate, if I didn't feed them information about Dante's movements and operations. I've been trying to find her, trying to figure out where they're keeping her, but every lead goes nowhere, and every day I betray the family I've served for 30 years, and I don't know how to stop." I felt my anger dissolve into sympathy, into recognition of impossible choices made under unbearable pressure. "Does Dante know?" I asked, and she shook her head. "If he knew, he'd try to rescue her, and Victor would kill her," she said. "Or he'd see me as the traitor I am, and I'd lose any chance of finding her myself. I'm trapped, Clara. I'm destroying everything to save one child, and I don't know if she's even still alive." I reached across the table and took her hand, this woman who had been so coldly professional with me, and I saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "We're going to get her back," I said. "And we're going to stop Victor. But I need you to trust me, and I need you to help me." She looked at me like I was insane, which was fair because what I was proposing was absolutely insane. But sometimes insane was the only option left when all the reasonable choices led to death and loss. I pulled out my phone and called Dante, my hands shaking slightly as it rang. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp with concern. "Clara, what's wrong? You should be packing." "I know about Margaret," I said, and I heard him go silent on the other end. "I know about her granddaughter. I know about Victor using her as leverage, and I know how we can fix this, how we can get Elena back and take Victor down at the same time." "Clara," he said, and his voice was dangerous now, low and cold. "What are you doing?" "I'm choosing," I said. "I'm choosing not to run, not to let you handle everything alone, not to be the passive victim who gets relocated for her own good. I'm choosing to fight." "You promised me," he said, and I could hear fear underneath the anger. "You promised you'd be careful, that you'd follow security protocols." "I'm being careful," I said, "just not in the way you meant." "Listen to me, Dante. We can use me as bait. Victor wants to hurt you through me, so let's give him the chance. We stage my final reading, we let Margaret tell him I'll be there, and when his men come, we're ready for them. We take them down, we get the location of where they're holding Elena, and we end this." The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought he'd hung up, and then I heard him breathing, harsh and controlled. "You're asking me to put you in danger deliberately," he said. "To use you as bait to draw out a man who has already proven he's willing to kill to get to me." "Yes," I said simply. "Because it's the only way to end this without you either killing Victor in open warfare, which will bring down law enforcement attention you don't need, or letting me disappear, which will leave the threat active and everyone you care about vulnerable. This way we control the situation, we choose the battlefield, and we get Elena back in the process." I heard him talking to someone in the background, probably running calculations and strategies, and then he came back on the line. "If I agree to this," he said, and his voice made it clear how much he hated the idea. "You follow my instructions exactly. No improvisation, no heroics. You do what I say when I say it." "I agree," I said. "But Dante, you need to know something else. Margaret isn't the enemy here. She's another victim. Victor took her granddaughter and forced her cooperation. When this is over, when Elena is safe, Margaret deserves mercy, not punishment." I could hear the conflict in his silence, loyalty and betrayal warring in his mind. And then he asked to speak to Margaret. I handed her the phone and watched her face as she listened to whatever Dante was saying, saw tears finally spill over as she confirmed the details about Elena, about the coercion, about her desperate attempts to find her granddaughter while betraying the only family she had left. When she handed the phone back to me, her expression was complicated, gratitude and shame and fear all mixed together. The plan came together over the next 6 hours. Dante coordinating with his security team while I stayed at Margaret's apartment, and we worked out exactly what information she would feed to Victor. My final reading would be tomorrow night at 9 p.m. as usual. She would tell Victor's contact, and Dante would be distracted with a business meeting in another part of the mansion, creating a window of opportunity for extraction or attack. She would also mention that most of the security detail would be occupied with the meeting, making the reading room more vulnerable than usual. It was believable because it followed established patterns, and Victor would see it as the perfect chance to make his move, to take me and use me as leverage against Dante. What we didn't tell Victor's contact was that the business meeting was fictional, that Dante's best men would be positioned throughout the house waiting for the attack, and that I would be wearing a tracker and a wire so they could monitor everything in real time. The next day passed in a haze of preparation and nerves. Ryan called from the hospital to say his first round of treatment had gone well and he was feeling hopeful, which made everything I was about to do feel even more significant because Dante had given me that hope and I wasn't going to let him face his demons alone. When the car picked me up at 8:30 that evening, I was dressed as usual, my bag of books on my lap, but underneath my calm exterior, my heart was racing. The mansion appeared through the fog, and Margaret met me at the door, her face carefully neutral, and she led me through the familiar halls one last time. The reading room had been restored, books back on the shelves and furniture replaced, No sign of the violence that had occurred there, except for spackling over the bullet holes in the walls that hadn't been painted yet. Dante was waiting, sitting in my reading chair rather than on the bed, and when I entered he stood and crossed to me and pulled me into a fierce embrace. "If anything goes wrong," he whispered against my hair, "if they get past our defenses, you run. You don't try to be brave, you don't try to help, you just run and you keep running until you're safe." "I won't need to run," I said with more confidence than I felt, "because you're the best at what you do, and what you do is protect what's yours." He pulled back to look at me, his green eyes intense and afraid and determined. "You are mine," he said. "You understand that. Whatever happens tonight, whatever comes after, you're mine and I'm yours and nothing changes that." I kissed him then, soft and brief, a promise rather than a goodbye. "Then teach me how to be yours in this world," I said. "Show me how to stand beside you instead of behind you." We took our positions, me in the reading chair and Dante on the bed, but everything felt different tonight, charged with anticipation and danger. I opened The Velveteen Rabbit because it felt appropriate, themes of becoming real through love and pain, and I started reading in my steadiest voice while my ears strained for any sound that didn't belong. 20 minutes in, exactly as Margaret had predicted based on Victor's previous patterns, I heard it. Breaking glass somewhere on the first floor, shouting, footsteps running through halls, and Dante was moving before I could react, positioning himself between me and the door while speaking quietly into a radio I hadn't seen him carrying. "They're in the East Wing," he said. "3 men moving toward the stairs. Hold positions until my signal." The door to the reading room burst open and 2 men entered with guns drawn, and I saw Dante's body coil with readiness, saw him calculating angles and distances, but he didn't move yet, letting them get further into the room, letting them commit. One of the men grabbed me, yanking me out of the chair with painful force, and I bit back a scream as his gun pressed against my temple. "Where's Kozlov?" Dante asked, his voice deadly calm despite the situation. "Where is he keeping the girl?" The man holding me laughed, ugly and confident. "You think we're going to tell you anything," he said. "You're going to let us walk out of here with your little pet, or I put a bullet in her head right now." "Now," Dante said into the radio, and suddenly the room exploded with movement. His men came through the door and windows simultaneously, overwhelming. Victor's men with practiced efficiency, and Dante moved like lightning, disarming the man holding me before I fully registered what was happening. Within seconds, both intruders were on the ground, disarmed and restrained, and Dante had his hand on my face, checking for injuries with frantic thoroughness. "I'm fine," I said, though my heart was hammering and my hands were shaking. "I'm fine. Did we get what we need?" One of Dante's men was already on his phone coordinating with teams throughout the city, tracking the signals from the intruders' phones and radios, triangulating locations, and within minutes they had an address. "Warehouse on the South Docks," he reported. "Heavy security, at least a dozen men. And thermal imaging shows what looks like 2 heat signatures in a locked interior room, adult and child-sized." Dante's expression went cold and focused, the predator fully emerged, and he was already moving toward the door issuing orders. "Full assault team," he said. "I want Victor alive if possible, but the priority is the girl. Anyone who gets between us and her goes down, no hesitation." He turned back to me and I saw him struggling with leaving me, with trusting that I would be safe while he went to finish this. "Go," I said. "Go get Elena. I'll be here when you get back." He kissed me hard and desperate, and then he was gone, taking half his men with him and leaving the rest to secure the mansion and guard me. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her face pale and hopeful and terrified. "He's really going after her," she said. "He's really trying to save Elena." "He's trying to save all of us," I said, and I took her hand and led her to sit with me while we waited, while Dante went to war for a child he'd never met, because it was the right thing to do, and because I had asked him to show mercy. The next 2 hours were the longest of my life, waiting with no information except occasional radio chatter that I couldn't fully decipher. Then finally, Dante's voice came through clear. "We have the girl," he said. "She's alive. She's scared. But she's alive. Victor is in custody. It's over." Margaret collapsed against me crying, relief and gratitude pouring out in broken sobs, and I held her while my own tears fell because we'd done it. We'd actually done it. We'd taken the insane risk, and it had paid off. When Dante returned an hour later, he had a small girl with dark hair and enormous frightened eyes clinging to his hand, and Margaret ran to her granddaughter and scooped her up, both of them crying and talking over each other. Dante watched them for a moment, something soft in his expression, and then he looked at me. "You could have been killed," he said, and his voice was rough with emotions he'd been holding back. "Do you understand that? You could have died because I let you talk me into using you as bait." "But I didn't," I said, crossing to him. "We didn't. And now we have a chance." "A chance at what?" he asked. "I'm still who I am. This world doesn't change. I'm not asking it to," I said, taking his hands in mine. "I'm asking if there's room in your world for bedtime stories and someone who sees past the blood to the man who just wants to sleep." He pulled me against him, his face buried in my hair, and I felt him shaking with exhaustion and relief and fear he'd been suppressing. "Why did you come back?" he asked quietly. "Why risk everything for this? For me?" "Because you're not the only one who hasn't slept well in years," I said. "Because when I read to you, I remember why I loved stories in the first place. They remind us what it means to be human, and you need that reminder more than anyone I've ever met. Because I love you." He went very still, then pulled back to look at me with wonder and disbelief in his expression. "Say that again," he said. "I love you," I repeated. "I love the man who paid for my brother's treatment without hesitation, who trusted me with his trauma, who went to war to save a child he didn't know because it was the right thing to do. I love you, Dante Russo, and I'm not going anywhere." "Will you stay?" he asked, and his voice was vulnerable in a way I'd never heard. "Not for money, not for safety, just stay." "On one condition," I said. "You have to learn to read to yourself eventually. I won't always be here." "Then I'll learn fast," he said, pulling me close. "I don't like the idea of nights without your voice." We ended up back in the reading room hours later after Elena had been checked by a doctor and put to bed in a guest room with Margaret watching over her after Victor had been delivered to authorities with evidence of his crimes after the adrenaline had faded, leaving only exhaustion. Dante was sitting in the reading chair when I found him, the Velveteen Rabbit open in his hands, and I realized with a start that he'd been reading ahead, had been learning the stories I brought to him. "Why that one?" I asked, and he looked up at me with an expression that was open and honest. "Because it's your mother's favorite," he said. "Because it's about becoming real through being loved, even when that love is painful and comes with scars. Because I want to understand the stories that made you who you are." I climbed onto the bed, fully clothed but exhausted, and held out my hand to him. "Read to me," I said. "Take turns with me." He came to the bed and settled beside me, and we passed the book back and forth, reading passages to each other while dawn began to break through the windows, the first time I'd seen this room in daylight. The morning light was golden and soft, making everything seem possible, making the darkness of the night before feel distant. I read about the skin horse explaining what real means, about how it doesn't happen all at once but gradually, and Dante's voice when he took his turn was rough and unpracticed but genuine, no performance, just him. His breathing began to even out as we read, the familiar rhythm working its magic, and his arm came around my waist pulling me closer. I kept reading even when I felt him relax completely against me, kept reading until I was sure he was deeply asleep, and then I set the book aside and just held him, this beautiful, dangerous man who had given me everything and asked only for stories in return. Outside, I could hear guards patrolling, the ordinary sounds of his world continuing, but inside this room, we had created something different. A sanctuary where he could be vulnerable and I could be strong, where stories mattered more than violence, where love was possible even in the darkest places. He slept for 8 hours straight, the longest he'd slept in 5 years, and when he finally woke, he looked younger, the shadows under his eyes less pronounced, the tension in his body eased. I was still there, still holding him, and when he opened his eyes and saw me, his smile was genuine and unguarded. "You stayed," he said. "I promised," I replied. "Some things are worth fighting for." He pulled me closer, and I felt his breathing even out again. Not sleeping this time, just resting, and I knew we would have challenges ahead, knew his world wouldn't suddenly become safe just because we loved each other. But I also knew we would face those challenges together. The book had fallen to the floor during the night, and I could see it from where we lay. The velveteen rabbit opened to the page about becoming real, and I thought about everything we'd been through to get to this moment, all the danger and fear and impossible choices that had led us here. "Real isn't how you are made," the skin horse had said. "It's a thing that happens to you." And it had happened to us, slowly and painfully and beautifully, two broken people becoming real through loving each other, despite every reason not to. Dante's hand found mine, and laced our fingers together, and in the morning light streaming through windows that had seen violence and fear, we found something precious and worth protecting, something that transformed bedtime stories from transaction into communion. Something that proved even in his dark world there was room for gentleness and hope, and the healing power of a voice reading in the darkness.